You think death is the end of life, but Ibn Arabi said the real death is the one you must experience while you are still alive. The death of the ego, the death of everything that keeps you from seeing the one. The death Ibn Arabi spoke of has nothing to do with your body. It is not the end of breath or the stillness of the heart. It is a different death, one that happens while you are still very much alive. It is the death of the layers that keep you from seeing reality as it truly is. The death of illusions. The death of the masks you've worn for so long that you mistook them for your face. The death of the false self you carry like a heavy coat, even though it was never truly yours. When Ibn Arabi said, "Die before you die," he was inviting you to let that false self fall away, so the truth beneath it could finally breathe. Most people live without ever meeting themselves. They walk through life as a collection of memories, fears, desires, opinions, and wounds. They become attached to a name, a story, an identity built from the outside world. They think this bundle of habits and beliefs is who they are. But Ibn Arabi called this the ego self, a temporary illusion, a shadow shaped by circumstances. It is the self that breaks when life becomes difficult, the self that feels threatened by change, the self that seeks control but never finds peace. As long as this self is alive, the deeper truth of your being remains hidden behind it. To die before you die means to let this ego dissolve. It means allowing the constructed self to fall apart, piece by piece, until only what is real remains. This death is not easy. It feels like loss, confusion, emptiness. You start to question everything you once believed about who you are. The friendships that fed your ego fall away. The ambitions you once chased lose their shine, and the roles you played no longer fit. It can feel frightening, like the ground beneath you is disappearing. But Ibn Arabi would say that this fear is a sign that the death has begun. The illusion is cracking. The truth is pushing its way through. This inner death is the gateway to life. When the ego dies, even for a moment, something extraordinary awakens. The part of you that is not defined by the world. The part that does not fear change because it is eternal. The part that recognizes itself as a reflection of the divine. Ibn Arabi said that when you remove everything that is not you, what remains is the one who has been living through you all along. The death of the ego is not destruction, it is unveiling. It reveals the reality that was always there, but obscured by who you thought you were supposed to be. So the death you must experience before your physical death is not meant to harm you. It is meant to free you. It is the moment when the false self collapses and the real self steps forward, silent and luminous. When you let the ego die, even briefly, you realize you were never separate from anything. You were never alone. You were never small. This is the first step Ibn Arabi calls you toward, the gentle, sacred death that opens the door to true life. The self that must die is not your soul, not your consciousness, not the light inside you. It is the constructed identity that you've been taught to protect your whole life. Ibn Arabi called it the veil, the layer that stands between you and the truth of who you are. This false self grows slowly, almost silently, from childhood until adulthood. It is built from praise and criticism, from expectations and fears, from comparisons and disappointments. It is the voice that says, "I am what others think of me," or "I am my achievements," or "I am my failures." This self is fragile because it has no reality of its own. It depends entirely on external things to survive. This is the self that must die. The ego tells you that you are separate, separate from others, separate from the world, even separate from God. It creates boundaries where none existed. It whispers that you must protect your image, defend your opinions, and cling to what you have. It thrives on fear. fear of losing, fear of changing, fear of being seen, fear of being forgotten. Ibn Arabi said that the ego is like a shadow that mistakes itself for the sun. It believes it is the source of your life, when in truth, it is only a reflection with no light of its own. This false self reacts to everything. When someone insults you, it burns. When someone praises you, it swells. When you face loss, it panics. When you meet love, it clings. It never rests because it survives only through constant movement, constant wanting, constant resisting, constant comparing. It pulls you away from presence and traps you in a world of stories about who you think you are. It is loud, restless, endlessly hungry. And as long as this self defines you, you cannot see the real. Its noise covers the whisper of truth that tries to rise within you. Ibn Arabi taught that the ego was never meant to rule. You were meant to rule over it. But when you forget this, when the ego becomes your identity, life becomes heavy. Every disappointment becomes a wound. Every change becomes a threat. Every failure becomes a death. This is why the ego must die, because it keeps you from living the life your soul was designed for. It turns your heart into a battlefield instead of a sanctuary. It blinds you to the divine presence flowing through everything you encounter. When the false self dies, even slightly, the world looks different. You stop taking things personally. You stop trying to be someone. You stop defending an image. The need to prove yourself falls away. The need to be right dissolves. What remains is a quiet awareness that watches without fear. You begin to feel spacious inside, lighter, more honest, more free. This is the self that Ibn Arabi called the real human, the one who sees with the eye of the heart instead of the eye of the ego. So when Ibn Arabi says you must die before you die, he is telling you, let the false self fall away before your body returns to dust, because only the one beneath the ego can taste the truth of why you were created. When the false self begins to fall away, what rises in its place is not a new identity, but the self that was always there beneath the noise. Ibn Arabi called this the real self, the pure consciousness that existed before the world touched you. It is the self you were before you learned fear, before you learned comparison, before you learned to shrink or pretend. It is the self made from light, the self that recognizes truth instinctively, the self that knows God not through concepts, but through presence. This self does not need validation because it is rooted in the source that gives everything its worth. When the ego dies, even for a moment, the real self breathes. Suddenly there is a stillness inside you, a quiet but unmistakable sense of being. You feel alive in a way that has nothing to do with excitement or achievement. You feel aware, grounded, connected. Ibn Arabi described this state as witnessing, a clarity that arises when the heart sees without the distortion of desire or fear. In this state, you are no longer pulled by the world. You move through it with a calm center. You no longer chase things outside you. You begin to feel the completeness that was waiting inside you all along. This real self does not cling, because it knows that everything comes from God and everything returns to Him. It is not afraid of change, because it recognizes that change is simply the unfolding of divine wisdom. It does not judge others harshly, because it sees the same light shining through every soul. Compassion is natural for this self, because it feels the unity that the ego could never understand. The real self does not need to win or dominate or impress. It simply is. It exists in harmony with the flow of life, trusting that whatever comes is meant to come, and whatever leaves is meant to leave. Ibn Arabi taught that the real self is the doorway to God. When the ego dissolves, the heart becomes a mirror, reflecting divine light without distortion. In that reflection, you begin to know who you truly are, not the story you tell, not the image you defend, but the consciousness that watches all of these things come and go. This is the part of you that never changes, no matter how many roles you play. It is the part of you that feels moments of sudden peace, sudden clarity, sudden connection. It is the part that understands silence. The real self is humble because it knows its source. It is fearless because it knows its essence. It is free because nothing can add or subtract from its being. When this self awakens, the world becomes a different place. Colors seem brighter, sounds softer, relationships deeper. You feel the presence of God in ways that cannot be explained, only experienced. You realize that losing the ego did not diminish you. It revealed the vastness you carried within. So when the false self dies, the real self rises like dawn after a long night. This is the self Ibn Arabi invites you to meet, the self that was never separate from the divine, the self that remembers, the self that truly lives. The ego was not created by accident. Ibn Arabi taught that every part of the human being, even the parts that confuse or trouble us, exists by divine wisdom. The ego is not a mistake or an enemy. It is a veil with a purpose. Without it, the soul could not experience individuality, responsibility, or the journey of return. The ego creates the illusion of separation so that love can unfold. Without separation, there would be no longing. Without longing, there would be no movement toward the beloved. And without that movement, the soul could not taste the sweetness of union. Think of the ego as a cocoon. It is not your final form. It is the temporary shell that protects you until you are ready to emerge. Inside it, you learn through contrast. You learn what fear feels like so you can recognize courage. You learn desire so you can recognize surrender. You learn pride so you can discover humility. Every experience the ego creates becomes a lesson designed to push you inward. Ibn Arabi said that the ego is like a mirror. At first, it reflects only yourself, but as you polish it through awareness and surrender, it begins to reflect the divine. The ego helps you navigate the world. Without a sense of I, you could not speak, act, or learn. But the problem begins when the ego forgets that it is a tool and starts believing it is the master. It begins to claim ownership, seeking control and validation, building an identity around things that were never meant to define you. It clings to the temporary, fears the unknown, and creates distance between you and others. This is when the ego becomes a veil, when it hides the light instead of reflecting it. But even this hiding serves a deeper purpose. The soul grows through contrast. If you were born already knowing unity, you would never understand its value. You would never recognize the depth of divine presence, because there would be no journey, no unfolding, no discovery. Ibn Arabi said that God created separation so that the human being could travel through the worlds of form, forget the truth, and then rediscover it within themselves. This rediscovery is the second birth, the spiritual awakening that happens after the ego breaks. The ego struggles. Its desires, fears, attachments become the very tools that lead you toward God. Every time you feel lost, you learn to seek. Every time you feel pain, you learn to surrender. Every time something you cling to is taken away, another layer of the false self dies. The ego pushes you to a point where you realize you cannot rely on it anymore. That realization is the doorway to awakening. So the ego must exist, but it must not rule. It must live, but it must not lead. Ibn Arabi said that the ego is like a stubborn horse, strong enough to carry you far, but only valuable if the soul holds the reins. When the ego thinks it is the rider, life becomes chaos, but when the soul takes control, the journey becomes effortless. Therefore, the ego is both veil and teacher, obstacle and guide. It is the contrast that reveals the light. It is the self that must die, so the self that never dies can awaken. There are moments in life when something inside you begins to crumble, and you don't understand why. The things that once excited you lose their meaning. The roles you used to play no longer fit. The world feels distant, and even your own reflection seems unfamiliar. Ibn Arabi taught that these moments are not signs of failure or confusion. They are signs that the ego is beginning to die. And like any death, it comes with symptoms. These are not punishments, they are invitations, warnings from the soul that the old self is dissolving to make space for the real one. One of the first signs is inner emptiness. You feel a kind of spiritual exhaustion that no rest can fix. The activities that once filled your time feel shallow. You can't pretend anymore. The ego thrives on distraction, but when the soul awakens, distraction loses its taste. You begin to crave silence, depth, meaning. You feel pulled towards something unseen, something you cannot explain. This emptiness is not a void. It is the clearing of space, the removal of clutter so the truth can enter. Another sign is the breaking of old attachments. People who once defined your identity drift away. Goals you once chased no longer feel like your own. You may lose interest in the things that made you feel important or special. This can feel painful, like pieces of your life falling apart. But Ibn Arabi would say, it is not your life that is falling apart. It is your illusion. Attachments are threads the ego uses to hold itself together. When the ego weakens, those threads naturally unravel. Then comes confusion, a deep, unsettling sense that you don't know who you are anymore. The identity you spent years building suddenly feels like a costume. This is one of the clearest signs of ego death. The false self is collapsing and the truth is pushing through. The mind panics because it cannot control what is happening, but the soul knows exactly where it is going. Confusion is the cracking of the shell before emergence. Another powerful sign is the surge of longing, a longing you cannot name. It is not for a person or a place or an achievement. It is a longing for something beyond the world, a return to something ancient, familiar, eternal. This longing is the soul remembering its origin. Ibn Arabi described it as the call of the beloved inside you, the whisper that says, "Come back, come home." The more the ego weakens, the louder this longing becomes. You may also feel moments of intense truth, brief flashes where everything feels connected, alive, purposeful. These moments don't last, but they shake you. They show you a glimpse of what lies beyond the ego, clarity that feels like sunlight breaking through clouds. After such moments, nothing in life feels the same. Finally, there is surrender. Not forced surrender, but natural surrender. You begin to let go of control, because something inside you knows that control was always an illusion. You stop fighting what life brings. You stop arguing with destiny. You start trusting in a way you never could before. This surrender is not weakness. It is the real self-awakening. These signs are not random. They are the soul's way of preparing you for the death that brings true life. Ibn Arabi said that the ego must tremble before it breaks, and it must break before the heart can open. Every confusion, every loss, every longing is a step toward the unveiling of who you really are. There are moments in life that feel like earthquakes. Something happens, something sudden, painful, unexpected, and the entire structure of who you thought you were begins to shake. These moments break the ego in ways gentle teachings never could. Ibn Arabi said that God sends certain experiences not to harm you, but to shatter the walls you built around your heart. Without these moments, the ego would remain solid, unmovable, convinced of its own importance. But when life cracks you open, the truth has a chance to enter. The ego breaks most deeply during heartbreak. Not only romantic heartbreak, but any moment when love, true love, collides with loss. when someone you cared for leaves, when trust is betrayed, when life takes something you were not ready to release, the ego screams, it clings, it panics, but the soul knows something else is happening. Ibn Arabi taught that heartbreak is one of the most sacred chisels of transformation, because it reveals the attachments the ego hid behind. Every tear washes away a layer of illusion. Every ache exposes a depth you did not know you carried. Another moment that breaks the ego is humiliation. When pride collapses in front of others, when your image gets shattered, when you are misunderstood or wronged, your ego burns. But humiliation, in the language of the mystics, is purification. It strips away the false honor the ego builds around itself. It returns you to humility, which Ibn Arabi called the foundation of true knowledge. You learn to stop performing. You learn to stop pretending. You learn to simply be. Failure is another divine hammer. When your plans collapse, when your efforts don't bear fruit, when your certainty dissolves, something inside you dies. The ego hates this death. It sees failure as the end. But Ibn Arabi taught that failure is often the beginning, the moment when you stop relying on your own strength and begin relying on the real. Failure breaks the illusion of control, and in that breaking, trust is born. The soul steps forward only when the ego steps back. Loss also breaks the ego in ways nothing else can. Losing a job, a loved one, a dream, an identity. Each loss is a small death. The ego attaches itself to what it thinks it owns, and when that thing is taken, the ego crumbles. But the mystics say, nothing that is real can ever be lost. Only illusions leave you. Loss is the fire that burns away everything that is not truly you. What remains after loss is what was meant to remain. There are also moments of deep loneliness that crack the ego, when no one understands you, when you feel unseen, when silence fills your nights. These moments feel like abandonment. But Ibn Arabi said that loneliness is not the absence of others. It is the presence of God pulling you inward. When the world becomes quiet, you finally hear the truth. You meet yourself. You recognize the part of you that was never alone. Even unexpected blessings can break the ego. Moments of pure beauty, sudden clarity, overwhelming love. These moments are too real, too vast, too divine for the small self to contain. The ego cracks because the blessing is larger than the container. Something higher touches you, and everything false inside you trembles. Beauty breaks you, so it can rebuild you. Every breaking is sacred. Every breaking is precise. Every breaking is a step toward awakening. Ibn Arabi said that God never breaks a heart except to open it wider, never empties you except to fill you with something deeper. The ego breaks so the soul can breathe. What feels like destruction is actually creation in disguise. Surrender is the moment the ego finally stops fighting. Not because it is defeated, but because it realizes it was never meant to carry the weight of life. Ibn Arabi said that true surrender is not giving up, it is waking up. It is the moment you understand that the one who created you is the one who sustains you, guides you, protects you, and leads you through every peak and valley. Surrender means allowing life to unfold without forcing it to match your expectations. It means trusting the wisdom behind every moment, even when you cannot see it. It is the quiet knowing that nothing meant for you can be lost, and nothing not meant for you can be held. The ego fears surrender because it believes surrender means losing control. But the deeper truth is that the ego never had control to begin with. It only imagined it. Surrender is seeing through that illusion. It is the moment when you stop trying to push the river and allow yourself to flow with it. Ibn Arabi said that the strongest person is not the one who holds tightly, but the one who releases. To surrender is to trust the Beloved's hand more than your own plans. It is to lean into the mystery instead of resisting it. Surrender feels like falling, but it is falling into safety, falling into truth, falling into the arms that have been holding you since before you were born. When you surrender, the constant chatter of the ego begins to fade. The anxiety softens. The need to prove, defend, or control starts to dissolve. You begin to breathe differently, deeper, quieter, freer. You feel a spaciousness inside you, as if your chest has opened and light is entering. This is not weakness. It is strength rooted in trust. It is the soul reclaiming its rightful place as the guide. Ibn Arabi described surrender as a kind of inner melting. The rigid boundaries of the ego soften and dissolve, leaving only awareness and presence. You stop saying, "This must happen," and start whispering, "Let me see what you have written for me." You stop asking for things to go your way and start seeking to see the wisdom in the way things are. Surrender does not mean passivity, it means clarity. You act, but without attachment to the outcome. You move, but without fear. You love, but without possession. You live, but without heaviness. In surrender, you begin to feel guided. You notice synchronicities, inner nudges, subtle signs that the path is unfolding in front of you. You realize you are not walking alone. Something greater is shaping your steps, arranging meetings, closing doors that would harm you, opening doors that lead you closer to truth. And the more you surrender, the more clearly you see this divine choreography. This state is what Ibn Arabi called the death of the ego, not the end of personality, but the end of resistance, the end of the illusion that you are separate from the real. When you surrender, you become transparent, like a window that lets the light pass through. You become an instrument of the divine, moved not by fear or desire, but by love and wisdom. Your decisions feel clearer, your reactions soften, your life becomes lighter. This is the meaning of dying before you die, letting the ego fall away so something higher can move through you. Surrender is the moment the false self steps aside and the true self steps forward, the self that trusts, listens, and loves without fear. When the ego dies, even a little, the world you thought you knew begins to look different. Nothing outside you has changed, yet everything feels transformed. Ibn Arabi taught that the world does not reveal its true face until the false self falls silent. Only then does the heart begin to see clearly. Without the ego's noise, its fears, its demands, its judgments, you begin to perceive the unity that was always present beneath the surface of things. You start to recognize that every moment is woven with divine intention. Every encounter is a meeting with the real, and every breath is a reminder that the one is closer to you than your own soul. When the ego dies, you no longer see life as a series of random events. You feel the interconnectedness of all things, a stranger's smile, the sound of the wind, an unexpected delay, a moment of silence. Each becomes a sign pointing to a deeper presence. You sense that everything is speaking, everything is guiding, everything is reflecting something inside you. Ibn Arabi said that the world is a mirror, and when your inner self becomes clear, the outer world begins to shine with meaning. You see God in places you never thought to look, in ordinary moments, in simple gestures, in the rhythms of everyday life. Fear begins to fade, because fear was always the ego's voice. The real self does not fear. It knows that whatever happens is written with wisdom. You no longer cling to outcomes because you trust the one who writes your story. This trust is not blind. It is a knowing, a deep feeling that you are held by something infinite. You stop resisting what life brings because you see the mercy hidden inside every moment, even the painful ones. Hardships feel different. They do not crush you the way they used to, because now you sense the transformation taking place beneath them. You understand that every challenge carries a gift, every loss makes space for something truer, and every ending prepares the heart for a beginning. Love also changes. It becomes wider, softer, less possessive. You stop needing people to complete you because the emptiness inside you has been filled by presence. You love others not out of need, but out of recognition. You see the same light that lives within you shining through them. Compassion becomes natural because you no longer feel separate. The pain of another feels like your own, and their joy feels like a blessing shared with your own soul. Ibn Arabi said that when the ego dies, the heart becomes spacious enough to hold the whole world. Even your relationship with yourself changes. You speak to yourself with more gentleness. The harsh inner critic loses its authority. The old sense of inadequacy softens, replaced by an inner warmth, a quiet acceptance. You begin to feel like you are finally meeting who you were always meant to be. Unmasked, unafraid, unburdened. You feel present, alive, awake. And the greatest shift of all is this: you no longer look for God outside yourself. You begin to feel Him in your breath, in your thoughts, in the stillness behind your awareness. The world becomes a living scripture, and every moment becomes a verse. This is what Ibn Arabi meant when he said that the world reveals its truth only when the ego dies. You do not merely see life, you see the one living through everything. When the ego dies, even for a moment, something profound returns to you, your true self. But the self that returns is not the one that left. It is quieter, clearer, softer, and infinitely more honest. Ibn Arabi taught that the ego's death is not the end of the self, but the beginning of it. The person who emerges after ego death is not a new identity you create. It is the original self that was buried beneath layers of fear, pride, and illusion. This returning self is the one your soul has been trying to reveal to you your entire life. The first thing you notice after this inner death is a deep sense of peace. Not the peace that comes from having everything go your way, but the peace that comes from no longer needing it to. You begin to live from the inside out, not the outside in. You act, speak, and choose from a place of presence rather than impulse. The constant inner pressure to be something, achieve something, prove something begins to dissolve. This new self has nothing to prove because it knows its worth does not depend on the world. It comes from the one who breathed life into you. Relationships transform as well. The returning self loves differently. It does not cling or chase. It does not demand or possess. It sees others through the lens of unity, not through the lens of scarcity. You begin to recognize the divine spark in every person, even those who hurt you. You stop taking things personally because you understand that people act from their own wounds, their own illusions. Compassion replaces judgment. Understanding replaces anger. Forgiveness becomes easier, not because you force it, but because your heart has expanded beyond the ego's narrow boundaries. Your priorities shift too. What once mattered so much begins to feel small. The ego chased recognition, status, validation, but the returning self seeks meaning, sincerity, presence. Ordinary moments become deeply fulfilling. Silence becomes nourishing. Solitude becomes sacred. You begin to crave things that nourish your soul, not your image. Ibn Arabi said that when the ego dies, the heart begins to seek only what belongs to it, and what belongs to the heart is the real. You also notice a new clarity. Decisions that once felt complicated become simple because they now come from truth rather than fear. You no longer betray yourself to please others. You no longer ignore your intuition. The returning self hears the inner guidance that the ego drowned out. Subtle whispers, quiet knowing, gentle nudges. Ibn Arabi wrote that when the false self disappears, the heart becomes the place where divine wisdom lands. Insight flows naturally because the barrier has been removed. Perhaps the most beautiful change is the return of authenticity. You no longer wear masks. You no longer hide behind roles. You no longer shrink to fit expectations or stretch to impress. You live in alignment with your essence, and that alignment feels like coming home after a long exile. The returning self is honest, humble, and free. It moves lightly through the world, not attached, not afraid, not seeking anything but truth. This is what Ibn Arabi meant when he said that the ego must die so the real self can live. The self that returns is not a fragment, it is whole. Not a mask, it is the face beneath the mask. Not a shadow, it is light. It remembers what the ego forgot, that you are more than a name, more than a story, more than a collection of fears. You are a soul clothed in human form, a mirror of the divine, a traveler returning to the One. When the ego dies, life does not stop. It becomes clearer. Ibn Arabi taught that the one who truly dies before they die continues living in the world, but no longer from the narrowness of the false self. Instead, they live from a state of openness, humility, and deep awareness. This does not turn a person into a saint removed from reality. It turns them into someone who moves through reality without being controlled by it. The awakened one still works, eats, speaks, and lives among people, but the reasons behind their actions shift entirely. Nothing is done for validation. Nothing is done out of fear. Nothing is done to feed an identity. Life becomes aligned with truth instead of ego. This state is subtle, not dramatic. It shows itself in small ways. You no longer rush to defend yourself every time someone misunderstands you. The need to prove your worth fades. You listen more than you speak. You act with intention rather than reaction. Your presence becomes calm, grounded, steady. People may not know why, but they feel different around you. Safer, understood, seen. Ibn Arabi said that the one who has died before dying becomes a place where others feel God's gentleness, because the ego no longer blocks the flow of divine qualities. You also begin to see through situations that once confused you. Where the ego saw chaos, the awakened heart sees wisdom. Where the ego saw offense, the awakened heart sees a mirror. Where the ego saw loss, the awakened heart sees space being made for something higher. This is not forced positivity. It is clarity. A clarity that comes from no longer interpreting life through wounds and fears. Ibn Arabi wrote that the truly awakened person sees things as they are, not as the ego paints them. Their perception becomes transparent, like pure water revealing whatever is placed within it. Living in this state does not mean the ego never returns. It rises from time to time, through anger, desire, pride, jealousy. But now, you recognize it instantly. Instead of merging with it, you observe it. Instead of becoming it, you witness it. The distance between you and your ego becomes wider, and in that space, choice appears. You can choose compassion over reaction, patience over impulse, humility over pride. This is the daily practice of living after ego death, choosing truth again and again until it becomes natural. The awakened person also begins to live with a sense of surrender that does not weaken them, it strengthens them. They act with effort, but without attachment to outcomes. They trust timing instead of fighting it. They understand that not every closed door is loss, not every delay is punishment, not every difficulty is misfortune. Ibn Arabi said that when the ego dies, the heart becomes a vessel for divine wisdom. Life begins to move through you rather than against you. You no longer resist the flow, you harmonize with it. And perhaps the most defining quality of this state is love, a love that has no opposite. Not romantic love, not sentimental love, but a love that arises from seeing God in everything. You love without ownership. You forgive without being asked. You give without expecting. You serve without feeling burdened. This is the love that appears when the ego disappears, because the ego was the only barrier between you and the one who loves through you. To live in this state is to walk lightly, as if your feet barely touch the ground. It is to carry an inner stillness even in the middle of storms. It is to move through the world with a heart that is awake, open, transparent, and free. This is what Ibn Arabi meant. When the ego dies, life does not end. It truly begins. In the end, ego death is not really death at all. It is a return to who you were before the world shaped you, before fear taught you to shrink, before desire taught you to chase, before pride taught you to pretend. Ibn Arabi said that when the ego dies, the seeker finally awakens to the truth that was always present. You are not separate from the real. The you that dies is only the illusion, the mask, the story. What remains is the one who has been living through you from the beginning. This final stage is not dramatic. It does not feel like a lightning strike or a grand revelation. It feels like recognition, a quiet, profound knowing that settles into your bones. You begin to see that the journey you thought was taking you toward God has always been God pulling you toward Himself. Every heartbreak, every test, every longing, every loss was a thread in that pull. Even your mistakes were detours designed to bring you back with deeper understanding. Ibn Arabi taught that the real never stops calling you. The veil only lifts when you finally answer. In this recognition, the seeker realizes there was never truly a seeker. The one who searched and the one being sought were always the same reality. It was God looking for God through the mirror of your being. The ego made you believe the journey was yours, but the truth is that the path, the traveler, and the destination are one. When this becomes clear, a deep peace unfolds. Not peace from the world, but peace with the world. The battles end. The resistance ends. The need to become someone ends. You simply return to being what you always were, a reflection of the infinite. In this state, life becomes effortless, not because challenges disappear, but because you stop fighting what is. You move with the flow instead of against it. You look at others and see not their flaws, but their divine essence shining through imperfect forms. You look at yourself and see someone who was never broken, only hidden. You begin to live as a vessel rather than an identity. The ego may still whisper, but it no longer rules. It becomes like an echo you hear without following. Ibn Arabi said that the one who dies before dying becomes alive in God. This does not make you less human. It makes you fully human, fully present, fully awake. You laugh more easily. You forgive more quickly. You love more deeply. You do not clutch at life because you know everything belongs to the One. You do not fear death because you have already died the death that matters, the death of illusion. And here lies the final secret. Ego death is not the end of individuality. It is the end of separation. You still live, but you live as a window, not a wall. Through you the real sees. Through you the real loves. Through you the real breathes. You become an instrument of divine presence, carrying silence in your chest and peace in your footsteps. This is what it means to die before you die. Not to disappear, but to awaken. Not to lose yourself, but to find the self that cannot die. Not to end life, but to begin it with eyes that finally see. If this touched your heart, share how ego has been breaking and awakening you in the comments, and subscribe to Caravan of Secrets for more journeys into the wisdom of Ibn Arabi, where every death is a doorway and every ending reveals the real.